There's a chamber buried somewhere beneath Langley, a cold, concrete vault that isn't marked on any blueprint. The air inside is thick with dust, and the lights flicker as if reluctant to reveal what's stored there. The walls are lined not with modern reports but with relics, cracked film reels, fatting parchment, leather-bound ledgers older than the agency itself. Few people in the intelligence community even know this archive exists. Those who do call it by its original name, Project Benediction. It began as an obscure OSS division in the 1940s focused on psychological anomalies in historical theology. In simpler terms, they were looking for ancient methods of mind control hidden inside religious texts and witch trial records. Among those records, three cases stood apart. Three women, centuries dead, accused of witchcraft in Europe, yet their names appeared again in early CIA transcripts. Eveline du Marais, Isolde of Rheinberg, and Katarina Valenti, supposedly executed by the Church, yet referenced in Cold War-era research as Subjects 0 through 2 in an operation that compared occult ritual to psychological manipulation. Their confessions, rediscovered in monastery ruins after World War II, described something the scientists could barely understand: tones and sigils that could bend emotion, symbols that triggered obedience, rituals that rewired the human will. The investigators dismissed it as myth at first, until the experiments began to work. What these women called invocations, the agency reclassified as behavioral induction protocols. The Church tried to burn their knowledge, the CIA tried to weaponize it. And somewhere in the silence between those two powers, the truth was lost, or buried deliberately. Because anyone who grasps how belief reshapes the mind holds the only form of control that truly matters. In the spring of 1629, in a grey fortress outside Toulouse, a woman named Eveline du Marais was led into a stone chamber to be questioned. The Church called her a witch. History nearly forgot her. But the CIA files list her differently: primary subject, cognitive induction, stage I. Eveline wasn't a peasant healer or a fortune teller like most accused women of her time. She had studied under a Jesuit scholar exiled for heresy, a man obsessed with the mathematics of prayer. Together, they explored whether rhythm and sound could create trance states strong enough to alter behavior. Eveline kept his notebooks after he vanished. Those same notebooks would later surface in a secret OSS shipment from war-torn France. According to her 17th century interrogation record, she didn't scream when questioned. Instead, she began humming. Low, steady tones, each separated by precise pauses. The guards who listened reported nausea, vertigo, and a strange sensation of disappearing behind their own eyes. The Inquisitor wrote that her song caused the faithful to forget their faith. Centuries later, declassified CIA research under Project Benediction noted identical effects. Frequencies between 17 and 19 Hz were tested for emotional destabilization, in other words, fear and obedience through vibration. It's written coldly, clinically, but the parallel is unmistakable. Eveline had found the same frequency 300 years earlier. When asked to confess, she didn't deny anything. "Yes," she said softly, "I can make them obey, but I learned it from your prayers." That single sentence was redacted in every copy found afterward. Eveline du Marais was executed on June 3, 1630, yet her final words were preserved by a priest who later defected to the early Illuminist sects in Germany. Belief is only a pattern of sound repeated often enough to become real. When Project Benediction analyzed the transcript, they didn't treat it as a warning, they treated it as a formula. A century after Eveline's death, far to the north in the German states, another woman was accused of sorcery. Her name was Isolde of Rheinberg, though the CIA file lists her as Subject Beta. She wasn't a midwife or herbalist like most who faced the stake. She was an astronomer, one of the few women in Europe trained to read celestial charts. Her arrest came after the discovery of a strange diagram she'd drawn on the walls of her workshop. A web of intersecting stars overlaid with circles and symbols that resembled neurological diagrams centuries ahead of their time. The Church believed it to be a magical sigil. Modern analysts recognized it as a kind of cognitive map, a schematic of emotional response patterns. During her trial in 1731, witnesses said she predicted her own interrogation schedule down to the hour, claiming the heavens told her when fear would peak. The Inquisitor thought she was mocking him. But the pattern of dates she noted aligns precisely with lunar cycles later proven to influence human sleep and hormonal rhythms, data that wouldn't be formally studied until the 20th century. When agents from Project Benediction reviewed her file, they noticed something even stranger. Scribbled in the margins of Isolde's confession were notations in a different hand, possibly by a monk who'd observed her execution. He wrote that her final words were, "The mind is a planet, not a prayer." In the 1950s, those same words became the unofficial motto of a CIA subproject codenamed Chimera, devoted to studying astrological archetypes as predictive behavioral indicators. They weren't looking for magic. They were mapping consciousness the same way Isolde mapped the stars. Her forbidden astrology wasn't superstition, it was pattern recognition. She believed every emotion, every fear, every act of obedience followed a cosmic rhythm, and anyone who could chart that rhythm could steer human thought like a tide. The church burned her body, the agency built a theory from her ashes. Venice, 1794. A woman stands on the balcony of a decaying palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal. Her name is Caterina Valenti, and by the time she was 20, she was already rumored to be the most dangerous courtesan in Europe. Her lovers included bishops, generals, and an Austrian noble who would later fund secret medical experiments in Vienna. But what made Caterina truly feared wasn't her beauty, it was her memory. She never forgot anything. Every conversation, every whisper, every confession remained word-perfect in her mind. The church called it possession, modern researchers would call it hyperthymesia. To the CIA analysts who studied her centuries later, it was something even more intriguing, a perfect subject for behavioral imprinting. Katarina's own writings, discovered in 1946 inside a monastery archive looted by German officers, describe her experiments with what she called reflected will. She believed that human desire could be mirrored, that by repeating someone's gestures, breathing patterns, and speech rhythms, she could steer their choices without them realizing it. In her journals, she wrote, "I do not command, I remember their hunger for them." Those notes were later translated and circulated within a post-war research group under Project Monarch, an MKUltra offshoot exploring trauma-induced cognitive reprogramming. The Valenti transcripts were marked historical precedent. Catarina's downfall came when the Venetian Inquisition accused her of seducing a cardinal and convincing him to divert church funds toward ritual architecture. He confessed that under her gaze, he felt God abandon him. She was tried in secret, her testimony sealed in the archives. The CIA version of that testimony contains only fragments. Memory is the chain, repetition is the lock, a pain is the key. Phrases eerily similar to MKUltra manuals written 2 centuries later. No record exists of Katarina's execution. Some believe she escaped north disguised as a physician's widow. Others say the church kept her alive, experimenting on her mind until it broke. Either way, Project Monarch's founders considered her their unintentional mother. 3 women, 3 centuries apart. One identical discovery, that the mind could be shaped, dismantled, and rebuilt not by sorcery but by belief, repetition, and control. By 1951, the world had changed, but its obsessions hadn't. The Cold War wasn't only fought with missiles and spies, it was fought with minds. The newly formed CIA had begun experimenting with hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and chemical truth serums. Yet hidden inside those sterile laboratories, a handful of analysts were studying something far stranger. They had uncovered fragments of old European documents, witch trial records, confession transcripts, and demonic possession reports that seemed to describe the same effects they were trying to reproduce in their labs. The connection wasn't coincidence. After the fall of Berlin, Allied teams recovered entire libraries of occult research stolen by the Nazis, who themselves had raided church archives across Europe. Among them was a box marked Benediction, containing copies of the Evelyn du Marais, Isolde of Rheinberg, and Catarina Valenti interrogations. The language was archaic, the theology outdated, but the psychological mechanisms, sound, repetition, ritual, trauma, matched exactly what the CIA was exploring under Project MKUltra. It was Alan Dulles himself who approved the creation of a historical behavioral division. Its job, translate medieval mysticism into modern science. One memo reads, "The church used fear, will use data, but the outcome is identical obedience." The scientists found that the old spells weren't magic words, but structured patterns of sensory overload and emotional collapse. The witches had unknowingly described what would become the blueprint for conditioning programs: break identity, replace narrative, repeat until belief reforms. The Benediction team began testing these techniques on volunteers and prisoners, layering religious ritual over psychological experimentation. Candlelight was replaced by fluorescent bulbs, confessionals by observation rooms, hymns by controlled frequencies. The symbols changed, but the aim remained, to prove that faith, whether in God, ideology, or state, could be engineered. When journalists later exposed MKUltra, none of this was mentioned. The church's role was erased. The witches' names were classified. The only surviving note in the Benediction archive reads, "Their curse was discovery." In the spring of 1957, deep beneath a decommissioned naval hospital in Maryland, researchers began testing a theory they'd quietly taken from the Evelyn du Marais transcripts: that sound alone could shape emotion, even override moral will. They called it Operation Concord. Officially, it was an acoustic study in human stress response. Unofficially, it was an attempt to rebuild Eveline's Song of Obedience. The team fed subjects low-frequency vibrations barely perceptible to the ear. The volunteers, mostly young servicemen, reported nausea, disorientation, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Several begged to leave. Within weeks, the researchers noticed something else. Those exposed longest showed extreme suggestibility afterward, accepting orders without hesitation, even when the instructions made no sense. One scientist recorded in his journal, "She was right, the hum bends faith." He wasn't quoting scripture, he was quoting Eveline's last words before her execution in 1630. The project soon escalated. They brought in psychologists from Stanford Research Institute, neurologists from Walter Reed, and even a few consultants from military chaplaincy. Their goal wasn't just to replicate obedience, it was to translate belief into a measurable frequency. They built a machine the size of a cathedral organ, wires snaking across the floor, designed to synchronize human brainwaves into harmonic submission. When the first full test ran in August, everything went wrong. The power surged, the lights died, and half the recording equipment burned out. A surviving audio reel plays only static, punctuated by a rhythmic pulse. Technicians who heard it later swore they felt sick for hours. Two resigned the same night. The official report called the event equipment malfunction. Unofficial memos described it as psychological contamination. After that, the benediction files were sealed again until the late 60s when the experiments returned under a new code name, Project Harmony. The CIA had rediscovered what Eveline had sung centuries earlier, that control need not shout, it only has to hum. By 1964, the space race had ignited a new kind of paranoia. While rockets pierced the upper atmosphere, another competition was unfolding in silence. One fought over the boundaries of consciousness itself. In a nondescript building outside Langley, Project Harmony reopened the second of the ancient cases, the charts of Isolde of Rheinberg. To the untrained eye, her diagrams looked like medieval astrology, circles and intersecting lines connecting planets and symbols. But when researchers overlaid them on magnetic field maps and psychological stress graphs, something uncanny appeared. Each of Isolde's celestial alignments matched measurable fluctuations in human brain activity recorded across test populations. The CIA analysts began to wonder, had Isolde stumbled upon a primitive model of psychospheric resonance, the idea that emotional states might synchronize across large groups when planetary and geomagnetic conditions aligned? They didn't call it magic. They called it mass mood entrainment. Using early satellite telemetry, they plotted riots, religious revivals, and political assassinations against solar flare data. The correlation was unsettlingly precise. A memo dated July 12, 1965 noted, "She predicted fear as if charting a storm." They built astral maps of entire cities, layering population density over lunar and magnetic cycles. One experiment attempted to induce calm across a test group using rhythmic light flashes tuned to Isolde's recorded intervals. Within minutes, participants' heart rates synchronized, their speech patterns slowed, and half reported a sense of collective belonging. To outside observers, it looked like guided meditation. To insiders, it was proof that crowd emotion could be engineered, exactly as Isolde had claimed centuries earlier. But there was a problem: the effect didn't fade when the machine stopped. For days afterward, subjects experienced shared dreams and déjà vu as if their minds were still orbiting a common psychic center. Scientists couldn't explain it. The records simply note, the resonance persists beyond signal termination. When word of the study reached senior officials, the entire subproject vanished. The astral maps were locked away again. Officially, they never existed. Unofficially, they became the foundation for a new branch of psychological warfare, one that turned superstition into strategy. The Cold War had entered its fevered psychological phase. Espionage was no longer just about codes or missiles, it was about perception. And deep inside a covert program known as Project Monarch, the CIA turned its attention to a Venetian woman who had died 2 centuries earlier, Caterina Valenti. Caterina's journals, recovered from the ruined monastery after World War II, had been translated and dissected by linguists, anthropologists, and behavioral scientists. To most, they read like romantic diaries laced with esoteric philosophy. To Monarch's lead researcher, Dr. Raymond Holt, they were something else entirely, a manual for mimicry. Caterina had written that the key to control was reflection. She learned that by mirroring someone's gestures, breath, and cadence, she could cause the mind to enter a state of subconscious synchronization. The CIA recognized it instantly. It was the same principle used in interrogation, rapport building, and hypnosis. Under Monarch, Holt and his team began experimenting with mirror exposure conditioning. Subjects were placed in mirrored rooms while an operator repeated their own movements a half-second later. After prolonged sessions, test subjects lost their sense of individuality, referring to themselves in plural form. Some developed false recall, adopting memories suggested by the operators. When a congressional subcommittee later uncovered hints of Monarch, it was dismissed as urban legend, but fragments of declassified notes survive. One describes transference loops derived from Valenti's writings, a method of erasing personal will by drowning the mind in endless reflections of itself. Katarina's phrase, "memory is the chain, pain is the key," became the chilling motto of the experimenters. The most disturbing results came from sensory isolation combined with reflection training. After 48 hours in the chamber, several subjects claimed to hear a woman's voice whispering instructions in Italian. Recordings confirmed faint, rhythmic murmurs, no human source identified. Was it a collective hallucination, or something deeper echoing through time? Holt's final memo, written before he abruptly resigned, reads, "She's still teaching, the mirror never stopped." Project Monarch was quietly shut down in 1973, but the research didn't vanish, it scattered, absorbed into new behavioral influence initiatives. Somewhere in those modern divisions, Katarina's mirror still waits, reflecting whoever dares to look too long. By the late 1970s, fragments of Project Benediction, Harmony, and Monarch had scattered across different government branches, each pretending to be unrelated. Yet deep within the Defense Advanced Research Unit, one analyst noticed the same phrase recurring across all three archives: pattern of faith. That discovery led to the Convergence Initiative, a classified effort to merge the forgotten experiments of Evelyn du Marais, Isolde of Rheinberg, and Katarina Valenti into a single model of total influence. They wanted to test whether frequency, alignment, and reflection, the core discoveries of each woman, could be combined into one reproducible phenomenon: mass obedience. The experiment took place in 1978 at a remote desert facility in Nevada under the guise of electromagnetic testing. 40 volunteers were divided into groups, each exposed to synchronized sound frequencies drawn from Evelyn's humming tones, light pulses timed to Isolde's lunar intervals, and mirrored visual feedback based on Katarina's writings. At first, results were inconclusive. Then, around the 12th hour, all three test chambers began to experience identical reactions, subjects' heartbeats aligned. Their speech patterns became uniform. They began to chant the same phrase, words that were not part of the experiment script. The recordings, partially declassified in the 1990s, capture it faintly. "We remember the pattern, we remember the sound." Technicians shut down the equipment immediately, but the chanting continued for another 13 minutes. Afterward, the subjects displayed an eerie calm, describing vivid dreams of a woman singing beneath a cathedral of mirrors under a sky without stars. Psychologists couldn't agree whether the event was a shared hallucination or something more. Every trace of the Convergence Initiative was erased within weeks. The official record says it never happened, yet personnel files show every scientist involved requested reassignment within the year. Several left government work entirely, citing existential distress. One internal memo, unsigned but clearly written by a senior officer, states, "We have confirmed the principle, belief can be synthesized, the witches were right." After that, the archive was sealed once more. The experiments were buried not for failure, but because they worked too well. The agency feared no foreign enemy could match the weapon they had almost built, control born from faith itself. When the Convergence Initiative was quietly dismantled in 1979, the surviving researchers were dispersed like ashes on the wind. A few moved into academic psychology, hiding their methods under terms like behavioral resonance and effective entrainment. Others joined corporate think tanks designing early media algorithms. The rest simply vanished. Yet, according to a redacted 1983 memorandum, something persisted, an effect the CIA couldn't contain. The memo reads, "Residual synchronization detected in civilian populations following exposure to televised rhythmic broadcasts. Recommend indefinite suppression of benediction data." In simpler words, the witch's pattern had leaked into the culture itself. The parallels were uncanny. Music producers began using subsonic bass frequencies almost identical to Evelyn's tones. Television networks scheduled emotionally charged programs to align with lunar cycles, echoing Isolde's charts. Marketing firms developed psychological mirroring strategies straight from Katarina, reflected will. No one called it magic. They called it influence, advertising, engagement. But the skeleton of benediction was there, alive and thriving. Some former operatives later claimed they were haunted by recurring dreams, a triad of women standing in a darkened cathedral, their voices blending into one harmonic note that seemed to hum behind the world. Psychiatrists dismissed it as collective guilt, but the dreams were always the same. Today, fragments of the Benediction archive remain classified under psychological heritage assets. Most of the reels have decayed beyond recovery. Still, one transcription survives, a single page filed under Subject 0, Project Harmony. The handwriting is feminine, old, and fluid. It reads, "You buried us beneath cathedrals of reason and war, but the pattern doesn't sleep. You cannot kill belief, it merely changes uniform." If you look closely enough, at the way music builds tension, at how crowds move as one during a broadcast, at the rhythm of your own heartbeat when a message feels divine, you might feel it too. The echo of the witches who knew too much. They were hunted by the church, buried by the CIA. But their experiment never ended. It simply became the world we live in.